Okay, so this video is going to look at the social influence topic. So this is a 24 mark or 30-minute section in the end of year exam. In the end of next year, it will sit in paper 1. So this is the AQA spec for social influence. You'll see there's some names of psychologists on there, which means you need to know what research they did, and you need to be able to refer to them by name and recognise their research from just their name. So that's Ash and Zimbardo and Milgram. So there's 3 researchers that you will need to know. Any key terms on the specification you would also need to know as well for social influence. So social influence is about trying to understand people's behaviour, looking at our behaviour in the context of other people. We're going to look at conformity, obedience, and minority influence. So conformity and obedience are examples of what we call majority influence, and then we will look at minority influence. So first of all, conformity is social influence where you change your behaviour to fit in with a group. So it's kind of yielding to group pressure as conformity. There are 2 explanations for conformity. These are informational and normative social influence. Both these explanations together are referred to as the dual process model, but these are your explanations for conformity. So ISI, so informational social influence, and NSI, normative social influence. ISI is conforming, to be correct. So it's more likely to happen in unfamiliar situations or an ambiguous situation. We're more likely to believe and in what we're conforming to, and it's more likely to lead to kind of conversion and deeper levels of conformity. So that's ISI. If we don't know how to behave, we tend to conform to what we think is correct. And NSI, or normative social influence, is where we want to be liked and we want to fit in with the group. So this tends to be more temporary. This tends to be kind of lower levels of conformity for normative social influence. You've got 3 different types of conformity. So you've got compliance, identification, and internalization. So this is moving kind of from shallow to deep levels of processing. So compliance is public and temporary. Identification can be public or private, but again, it tends to be temporary. And then internalization is public and private, and it tends to be kind of long-term, and this is deeper conformity here. So compliance, identification, and internalization. It's you need to be able to outline these different types. It's good to be able to practice your definitions. You've got tasks like these that you can use to practice your definition. Please use the resources in your booklet and the resources on Caboodle in order to do stuff like this. But if you want to have a guess, you want to pause me. So all of these are key terms, are all named on the spec. It's helpful to be able to define them. This is an example of a longer question you might get. It's a research conducted into conformity. So ASH can be used to describe and evaluate NSI and ISI. So we've looked at NSI and ISI. We're going to look at ASH. So ASH is based on conformity. Previous research was conducted by people like Latane and Dali, which looked at the power of a group. And Ash is looking at kind of his line judgment task. So wanted to see whether people conformed even when they knew the answer was incorrect. So Ash is named on the spec, so you would need to know his procedure, so you would need to know what he did. So this slide shows you the procedure of Ash's experiment. And then you would also need to know what Ash found out, what his findings were. And again, the findings are here. So Ash is named on the spec, so you would need to know his procedure and you would need to know his findings. There are replications of Ash that you can watch on YouTube. There are other bits of research that can be used to evaluate ASH. Smith and Perrin and Spencer, you would not need to know the names of these researchers because remember, they are not named on the spec. ASH's experiments, along with a lot of the experiments in social influence, are artificial. They are conducted in a lab. You can argue that this gives them higher control, higher replicability, but it makes it more difficult to generalize, and they do lack mundane realism. They do tend to fit the features of science because they are conducted in controlled conditions. However, so you could link conformity research to features of science. You can get longer questions like this on Steph and Jeff. This is a STEM question, which is 16 marks. So it would be kind of 646 in terms of the marks for this, AO1, AO2, and AO3. And this would be explanations for conformity. So this would be ISI and NSI. That's your mark scheme for the Steph and Jeff question. Just a reminder, when you're writing extended answers, when you're evaluating or kind of writing a 60-mark answer, try to use some kind of structure for your evaluation points to elaborate on them. You might use the Peel structure. You might use the Berger structure that Tutor2U uses that you might have seen online. Just have some kind of way of making a point and elaborating on that point. If you had a 16-mark question to outline and evaluate research into conformity, you would use ASH as your research. And that would be your outline, and then your evaluation would be an evaluation of ASH. So for example, you might talk about methodological issues there. And again, just a reminder, you've got all these key terms. They're named on the spec. Please, can you make sure that you can define them? Please, can you make sure that you can describe them correctly in an exam? So tasks like this, where you are matching up definitions and key terms, should be fairly straightforward for you. So ASH investigated conformity and then wanted to look at variables which affect conformity levels. So the first thing he did was investigate the difference in terms of task difficulty. So what ASH found is that if a task becomes more difficult, we're more likely to conform because of ISI, because of informational social influence, the desire to be correct. In terms of the group size or the majority size, what ASH found was that conformity increases as the size of the group increases up to a point. So you've got kind of an ideal group size of 4 or 5, and then the conformity tends not to increase anymore after that. And then unanimity, so an agreement, so unanimity will increase conformity. If you have a break in unanimity, so if you have some social support or you have a fellow peer that's dissenting, you tend to have less conformity. So you've got these 3 variables, group size, task difficulty, and unanimity that can affect levels of conformity. This can be looked at in kind of the replications of ASH that you can find on YouTube. This is an example of a question which looks at these variables, so task difficulty, group size, and unanimity. You could be asked to describe these features of conformity, and you could be asked to evaluate the features of conformity. Again, as ASH is named in the spec, please make sure that you're using ASH as your example of research. These are just some examples of evaluation paragraphs from your booklet that could be used in questions on explanations of conformity. The next study we're going to look at looks at conformity to social roles. So that's Zimbardo's experiment. Again, Zimbardo's named on the spec, so you need to be able to describe what Zimbardo did and what Zimbardo found. Again, there's lots of information online. There's lots of video clips online that should give you a good idea as to what Zimbardo did. And then his results. So you need to know what he did and what he found out. There's some evaluation of Zimbardo's research there. If you are asked to evaluate Zimbardo's research, it tends to be methodological evaluation points and ethical evaluation points for Zimbardo. And then we're looking at obedience. Now, Milgram is named on the spec, and the original Milgram article is in your booklet. It's worth having a read so you know what happens there. So again, aims, procedure, findings for Milgram, because Milgram is named on the spec. So Milgram is your obedience. research, and you can use Milgram's variations for any obedience, other bits of obedience research you want to use. So that's the advert Milgram used. That is what Milgram did. And those are the quantitative findings. So those are the number findings of what Milgram discovered. So 65% of his participants gave 450 volts. 100% of his participants gave 300 volts. You might also be asked about qualitative findings in terms of Milgram, and that's just your descriptions of what happened to Milgram's participants. In terms of evaluating Milgram, you can talk about the reasons for why people obeyed. You can talk about the methodological issues, so whether Milgram's experiment is ecologically valid. You can use Hoeffling's study to kind of give real life support for Milgram's findings. It's androcentric because he's only using males. And there are lots of ethical objections to Milgram. So you should have a page in your booklet filled in with kind of ethical objections to Milgram. And this just kind of sums up the ethical objections and then Milgram's responses to them. And just a reminder, so obedience is social influence where you are acting in response to an order from an authority figure. If you are comparing obedience and conformity, that's what's on the right of the screen. So obedience is more direct. In conformity, everyone is of equal status. There needs to be a difference in status, or at least a difference in perceived status for conformity. And then people tend to acknowledge their obedience, but they're more reluctant to acknowledge conformity. So that's just the differences between obedience and conformity. In terms of obedience, there are situational factors that influence how obedient we are. So proximity, location, and uniform are things that are named on the spec and you can be asked about. The Milgram variations are the ones you want to use for these examples. So you should have done this in lessons, but it's all these different variations. This is what you're looking at in terms of variations that would affect levels of obedience. So it's proximity, and legitimacy, and uniform. This is an example of a question that looks at these factors. Then you have social psychological factors or social psychological explanations of obedience. So these are different than situational factors. You've got these social psychological factors. So they are legitimacy of authority and agentic state. Students get confused between these and the situational factors. So AQA like to ask about these. So it's not situational, proximity, or uniform. It's legitimacy of authority and agentic state. So those are your social psychological factors that might affect obedience. The first one is displaying an agentic shift. So we either behave in an autonomous state, so we act on behalf of ourselves and we're responsible for our own behavior, or we act in an agentic state, so we act on behalf of someone else. We feel like they're responsible. When we move from an autonomous state to an agentic state, we carry out an agentic shift. We tend to do so because of binding factors, so features that make us feel like we need to stay in an agentic state and not move back to an autonomous state. In Milgram's study, you can link this to agentic states. The agent in Milgram's study is the experimenter. That's the person we're acting on behalf of. The binding factors were the verbal prods. So the please continue, the experiment requires that you go on, the verbal prods the experimenter was giving. And the teacher believed that they were obeying a legitimate authority because the experimenter had a white coat on and he was conducting the experiment in a legitimate situation in the university. There is research to support these social psychological factors. It is an example of environmental determinism. If you feel like you're in an agentic state because of the situation you're in, and then you can link it to the debate of kind of situational versus dispositional explanations, whether we're acting in a certain way because of the situation we're in, or whether we're acting in a certain way because of our personality. So we can argue an agentic state is a situational thing. You can also link this to Derren Brown's The Push if you would like to. This is a 16-mark question you could get on explanations for obedience. You would want to talk about legitimacy and agentic state. So we've looked at situational. A dispositional explanation is kind of about someone's personality. So remember, you've got situational explanations, so external circumstances, so proximity, uniform location. You've got social psychological factors, so that's legitimacy of authority, whether someone is a legitimate authority figure in that situation, an agentic state. And then a dispositional explanation looks at someone's personality. In terms of dispositionals, we can look at the authoritarian personality, which can be measured using the F scale, which you can do online if you like. The F scale found that high scorers had a certain cognitive style, so there's a correlation between authoritarianism and kind of prejudice, kind of bad feelings towards certain groups. The authoritarian personality is a certain personality type that would mean you would be more likely to obey and also more likely to want to give orders. The characteristics on the left are those associated with an authoritarian personality, and they link to the behaviours on the right. The authoritarian personality is meant to originate from childhood. So either you are scared of your parents and you are respectful of authority figures, or you dislike your parents and then you displace that hatred onto others. This authoritarian personality does have a psychodynamic kind of element to it. So it's this unconscious hostility from disciplined upbringing that is then maybe displaced onto other people and is conveyed through prejudice towards certain groups. You can evaluate the F scale in terms of how it was conducted, in terms of explaining a dispositional explanation of obedience. And you can also kind of criticize just generally using questionnaires such as the F scale to measure such traits in people. This is just an example of how you might write it as an elaborated point. So these are some evaluation points for the authoritarian personality. There's research support, however, it does ignore certain factors about people. And again, just some examples of how you can write this out. These are in your booklet. A trickier question would be something that asks you to determine an extent. So what extent do dispositional explanations explain obedience? And you would follow a format such as this if you had such a question. We have looked at conformity and obedience. We now need to look at resistance to social influence, so why people will resist conformity and why people will resist obedience. Social support and locus of control are specifically named on the spec. So you would need to be able to answer questions specifically on these two things in terms of resistance. So resistance is when you don't conform or don't obey, and it's been shown in Ash's study, it was shown in Zimbardo's study, it was shown in Milgram's study. So if you're asked for research to demonstrate an example of resistance, please use the named studies. There are examples in there, as well as in other bits of research. So in terms of conformity, social support is something that's really important in resisting pressure to conform. That's because social support breaks unanimity and means you are less likely to conform in a situation. You could criticize the ecological validity of research into this, however. you've got support from Milgram's study as well in terms of social support. And then you've got locus control, which is the extent to which you believe you're responsible for your own behaviour. If you have an internal locus control, you feel responsible, so you're more likely to resist obedience and conformity. If you have an external locus control, you are less likely to resist because you feel other people are responsible for your actions. So people with internal locus controls are more likely to show resistance. And these are just paragraphs that are in your booklet that demonstrate resistance. The things we looked at so far have been majority influence, so most people doing something. Now we need to look at minority influence, where you have some people that just don't kind of follow the crowd. Minority influence is a form of social influence where a small group of people will influence a larger group. It tends to occur through conversion. Majority influence, on the other hand, tends to occur through compliance. And minority influence involves a deeper level of processing and tends to lead to internalization. It is more likely if a minority is consistent, if they're committed, if they're flexible, and if they are relevant to society. So you want to be consistent, so have the same views over time. You also want to be committed, so you want to show an ability to suffer, so that's augmentation, and show a commitment to your cause. You also want to be flexible, so if you're seen as inflexible, people are less likely to listen to what you're saying. And over time, consistency, commitment, and flexibility will make people think about a minority topic, and they will convert people's opinions over time, which is something called the snowball effect. Relevance to society is also important. Things tend not to change unless they are relevant to the time scale in which they occur. Moscovici did some research into minority influence. It's referred as the blue-green slide study, and it's about the fact that consistency is the most important feature that a minority can have in terms of trying to change people's opinions. You can evaluate minority influence in terms of the fact it's lab studies, and you can outline and evaluate minority influence as a longer question. Social change is a process by which a minority can enact kind of change on a bigger level. It's an example of social influence. These are all examples of social change brought through minority groups. So social change will occur through NSI and ISI, and it occurs through 6 steps. So drawing attention to an issue, being consistent in a position, creating cognitive conflict or deeper processing, the augmentation principle, so taking risks or being harmed, the snowball effect, where you move from a minority to a majority position over time, and then you have social cryptoamnesia, so you forget that an idea has come from a minority in the first place. So research has suggested that group norms can help social change occur in terms of majority influence. So majority influence tends to occur in terms of social change through normative social influence. Minority influence explains social change through conversion. So this will be through drawing attention. Cognitive conflicts, you create cognitive dissonance where people have to think more deeply about what their views are. You want to be consistent in your position, and you want to be willing to suffer for your own views. So that's augmentation. The snowball effect is where opinions gradually change over time to majority viewpoint. And the suffragettes can be used as an example of minority impacting social change. Conformity tells us that dissenters make social change more likely, and that social change is encouraged in majority influence through NSI. And we've learned from obedience research that disobedient models make social change more likely, and that gradual commitment can lead to drift. So obedience can create social change through kind of a drift from smaller commitments to kind of bigger commitments. You can be asked about social change, and you can be asked about the economy as well. Remember, it does link to that psychology and the economy bit of the spec. That is the mark scheme for that question. And if you had a longer question, that is how you would approach it. So you could talk about social change and then give some examples of how social change would occur from either a minority or a majority. So that's all of social influence. Remember, you've got your booklets, you've got your textbooks, you've got the notes on Caboodle as well.